principally works on promoting national unity, peaceful resolution of conflict, and respect for diversity. Its most significant work on the problem of ethnic marginalisation was a series of audits, which many of you would have heard about, in 2016 of the public service and the relative representation of different ethnic groups in the public service. So the NCIC writes in its audit reports that it aims to dispel, quote, the misguided perception that counties were created for local people to wholly benefit from the financial, human, and natural resources of the county, what they call a possession syndrome. So there are 3 points, I think, about the NCIC that are significant in understanding how minorities and marginalised communities are being used as categories. The first is how they determine which ethnic groups to use as categories in their audit. So they use the 2009 census ethnic categories, but they make 3 changes based on, and this is a slightly strange list, based on material found in a 1993 Encyclopedia of the Third World, Wikipedia, and references to how these groups feel as well as their linguistic dialects. They refer several times to 42 ethnic groups, but they list only 38. So this illustrates, I think, the lack of consistency, even at the level of basic units of ethnic analysis, let alone determining marginalisation. Okay, so secondly, for the NCIC, across the 4 audits, they either don't provide a definition of minority or marginalised, or they use a tautological one, which defines minority and marginalised communities as groups originating from marginalised communities, which really is not remotely helpful. And thirdly, for the NCIC, the lists they come up with vary across the 4 audits, right? The lists of people they put in the different categories of minority and marginalised. And they, for the most part, don't provide any justification. For example, in the audit of the county public service, they list 17 groups as marginalised, 10 as small, including Kenyan Americans, and a further handful as culturally distinct, Maasai and Ogiek. These lists obviously don't cover all of the small or culturally distinct communities in the country, and it seems strange to prioritise the interests of Kenyan Americans. So like Ngek, NCIC are similarly vague on their reasons for choosing some groups and not others to classify as minority or marginalised. As many of you know, they also haven't done another audit since 2016, so the sensitivity of those audits, I think, is abundantly clear. Okay, so those are the commissions, and as we can see, they all take quite a different approach. I want to move away from the commissions and out into civil society and talk about the work of the Katiba Institute. So the Katiba Institute's work in this space is, I think, the most honest of all of the different mapping exercises I've looked at. They openly acknowledge that ethnic groups want counties or at least wards of their own, that Kenyans tend to vote ethnically, although of course we know that's contested, and that the way out of marginalisation is to get, quote, one of your own in a seat of power. They're not uncritical about these tendencies, but they do acknowledge them and try to work with them. In their effort at mapping, which is part of a bigger study on political participation, they take what I think is the most common sense approach of all of the different efforts I look at. Although they indicate in the study that part of what they do is identify the who and where around minorities and marginalised communities, unlike the commissions, they don't make a list. Instead, they start by working out which counties are most relevant, and to do that, they use other reports and also common sense measures like knowing Nubians are in Nairobi and Maasai are in Kajiado. They then did qualitative field research in those counties, and they produced a thematic report where various minorities and marginalised communities are mentioned, but they don't claim any definitive mapping. This, of all the reports, strikes me as offering the most sensible account of who is in need, and one that is flexible enough to bend as those needs might change over time. Okay, so If we then move a little bit further out, so we've gone from law to bureaucracy to civil society, and for the last empirical part of the paper, I want to move out to citizens. So citizens, for the most part, are undeterred by this inconsistency or lack of clarity. Code seeking, as I call it, is an increasingly common practice whereby communities who feel unrecognised go about lobbying anyone who will listen to be given a code or gazetted. It sometimes includes a request for a particular number, the next imagined number on the imagined list, something in the vicinity of 43, 44, 45. For two communities, Makonde and Asians, this, as you know, was successful. When he was president, Uhuru Kenyatta gazetted them as the 43rd and 44th tribes of Kenya, respectively. To be clear, though, there is no preceding list of 42. On a symbolic level, it is then no surprise that other communities want this same form of recognition. But beyond its symbolic value for communities and its clear electoral value for politicians, the code has no official status. It's not linked to any official policy. It has no regulatory or legislated impact on any bureaucratic lists. It doesn't guarantee citizenship, and it doesn't guarantee affirmative action. This does not, however, seem to have stopped anyone from wanting one. So my work on all of this started with me wondering about the Nubian community's abiding demand to be recognised as the 43rd tribe of Kenya. I've been working with the community since 2009. In that year, the Bureau of Statistics KNBS wrote to the Kenya Nubian Council of Elders to promise that they would be counted in the upcoming 2009 census as the 43rd tribe of Kenya. And the community celebrated, for they had been excluded for a long time from the multi-ethnic fabric of Kenya to do with discrimination about having been brought by the British from Sudan as soldiers in the colonial army. Nubians were counted in the 2009 and the 2019 censuses. They began to find it easier to get ID cards, although they do still have problems with that. And they were even given land title in 2017, although it was in the lead up to an election. So you might have been forgiven for thinking that the matter was settled. Nubians are officially a quote unquote tribe of Kenya. But this is not so. And it's not because Makonde were also recognised as the 43rd. Over recent years, another campaign has emerged. And this campaign is being driven by Nubian Rights Forum, a community-based organisation of younger Nubian activists whose work has predominantly been around access to citizenship. Indeed, most of the communities who are involved in code seeking do so because of issues related to discrimination in access to ID cards. The former MP for Kibra, where the Nubian Rights Forum is based, petitioned Parliament on this issue, and as a result secured a recommendation that, quote, the Nubian people be recognised as a tribe in the Republic of Kenya. So this was to be done within the Ministry of Interior and National Coordination, which, as many of you will know, houses various registration bodies, including those responsible for ID cards. This suggests perhaps it is the National Registration Bureau that manages codes. But how and why? How does this relate to the census code? Is it the same? Is it different? And more importantly, why should one need an ethnic code to get citizenship? I have several other similar stories from Wayu, Sakuya, Pemba, and Shona communities. Each of these have a slightly different dynamic. The Wayu concern is about naming, for example, and wanting a move from a derogatory term to a more respectful one. The Sakuya claim is about not a lack of recognition per se, but inconsistency. Sometimes they appear on lists, like in the census, and sometimes they don't, like when registering for the Huduma cards. All communities seeking codes in one way or another have strong claims to marginalisation. And they see a code, whether in a general sense or more specifically with the NRB or the census, they see these codes as a path out of marginalisation. But it is far from clear how these codes work, who governs them, how they relate to each other, or most crucially, what role they play in securing rights or development. The census data is not disaggregated by ethnicity, so it can't be used to argue for development for particular groups. The NRB list serves some opaque bureaucratic function, but citizenship is guaranteed in the Constitution and it's guaranteed to individuals, not ethnic groups. So what is clear from all these examples is that there is no coherence or consistency whatsoever in these lists, not in their content, not in their form, and not in the criteria or the logic used to determine them. I've counted no less than 96 different ethnic groups referred to as minority or marginalized in these various reports. So the question is then, does this matter? Does it matter that there is inconsistency and uncertainty? Should list making continue? And if so, how? Okay, so this moves into the kind of final part of my talk where I want to make my main argument. One possible resolution to the uncertainty of these lists is to keep trying, right? Keep trying to make one. This is what NGEC are currently trying to do. But this seems to me to be a fool's errand. The lists will always be wrong. Some will always be excluded. Others will emerge from marginalisation. And I think the inconsistency I've shown here demonstrates that point. Another possible resolution is to do away with the idea of a list of minorities and marginalised communities altogether. But I don't think that is the solution either, though it might carry risks to keep making lists. Without them, it is far from clear how marginalisation for particular ethnic groups can be addressed. So this brings me to a third possible resolution, which is the one that I want to recommend. This proposition takes something that is already happening and makes it a little bit more deliberate. That is, working with uncertainty and inconsistency. So there is a ready explanation in political sociology about categorization. The state and other powerful entities like the World Bank seek to make populations legible in order to make them more governable. This view is promoted by scholars like Foucault and James Scott. They see classification as an exercise of power over a population, an exercise with often problematic effects, despite often good intentions. Racial classifications in apartheid South Africa are a good example of the extreme end of this practice and its worst effects. While I think these risks must be kept in mind, I'm not sold on this as the best reading of what is going on in Kenya. Bureaucratic classification in Kenya is not a tight grid like it was in South Africa, for example, where white supremacist desires for racial purity were deep and strong, and where classification was used as a way to achieve that. As we've seen, in Kenya, there is not even a single master list of ethnic groups. The way ethnic classification has worked has been much more flexible. A desire for order and hierarchy, South African style, is not, I don't think, enough of an explanation of what is going on here. I suggest that we can understand the messy and inconsistent nature of these lists as a result of what I call cultivated vagueness. Uncertainty shadows certainty and precision at almost every turn. The colonial desire for order, which was itself never fulfilled, is no longer the sole guiding principle in the way these lists are being made and the way they work. That desire is obviously still there. People are still working hard at these lists. People are still seeking codes, but it is accompanied by at least two other desires. One of these is, I think, concerning: the manipulation of this category for either personal gain or to continue the privileging of already relatively privileged ethnic groups. The example of the recent allocation of county assembly seats meant to be reserved for minorities and marginalised communities is a good illustration of that. But there is also another desire here in the way the vagueness is put to work, which I think is equally significant. And that is the desire to keep the peace, to be inclusive, and to redress past wrongs. The Katiba report, for example, takes this approach, and arguably so does the Commission for Revenue Allocation in the way it addresses marginalisation by area, perhaps not so much by group. In both of these cases, a cultivated vagueness serves the advancement of these desires more than precision or consistency, this kind of idea of classification as a fixed grid. To manipulate access to resources in self-serving ways requires a vagueness that allows choices to go unquestioned. But similarly, to advance inclusion to groups whose rights, citizenship, or claims to redress might be contested is easier when being delicate than being ordered, easier when being generous than when being precise. Cultivated vagueness performs important political functions that can't be overlooked or reduced to incomplete projects of list making. It is not just a case of not yet having got the list right. So the suggestion that I want to make at the core of this chapter and the book more generally is that there is some political potential in this uncertainty that might be fostered as a way of navigating the impasse on the question of whether or not to classify ethnic groups and how to foster more democratic relationships between ethnic groups. While I don't have time to get into this detail today, there are several theoretical insights about the potential of uncertainty that I'm drawing on to make sense of this. One of these is a theory of identity from Cameroonian anthropologist Francis Nyamjo. He talks of identity as inherently incomplete, not unfinished, but a permanent work in progress. The basic idea is that, and I quote, "We're not pretending, claiming identities in abstraction, or being defined and confined by others. Africans contest taken for granted and often institutionalized and bounded ideas and practices of being and becoming. In such a state of becoming, people are open-minded and open-ended with their identities and their approaches to belonging. There is a fluidity to ethnic identification that is not well captured by fixed list making. Not only that, but this fluidity is part of what enables good interethnic relations, relations of solidarity and even enjoyment of each other's cultures and views. And that is something that I think needs to be fostered." Another theoretical idea that I have talked about in a previous seminar at IDS is the idea of magic as a metaphor. Anthropologist Veena Das offers the concept of magic as a way of understanding the illegible nature of the state in India. Her basic argument is that often it is so unclear what is going on in bureaucracy that even the bureaucrats themselves don't know. And I'm sure many of you have had that kind of an experience. In these circumstances, it's often best not to ask. Asking can land you in trouble. Like magic, the state can be obscure, powerful, and frightening. I like this idea because it captures some of the hesitancy I've seen in this research. Why, for example, people don't question the idea of a code. But I think we need to add to it that magic can be good too. It can give blessings that one also might not want to question. In this sense, there is some potential, I think, for playing around with uncertainty in ways that could be constructive. So if identities are inherently and graciously uncertain, and uncertainty in knowledge and state practices can be beneficent, how can we augment those more just, inclusive, and democratic tendencies? And this is a question that can only be worked out, I think, in the detail, in the very fine-grained bureaucratic and political practices of the kind that I've explored here. So I want to finish with 4 take-home messages about what that might mean in practice. I've just sort of done a very academic and theoretical account, and so let me just kind of clarify what that means in practical terms. Firstly, my main take-home message is that I have major doubts about the wisdom of a fixed list. To fix a list in this way would carry several risks. The main one is that it robs people of the flexibility to be responsive to particular situations. This flexibility allows for more inclusion rather than less, as new groups pop up or change identities, or as political, social, or economic dynamics change, as they always do. It also allows for sensitivity in complex situations. Take the northern part of the country, for example, whereas Dale Abraham, who's going to speak with us shortly, has shown in his writing, several different groups shift and change the aspects of their identities they emphasize and perform, not just over years, but even over the course of a day. Fixed lists make this hard and deny those people the opportunity to navigate challenging situations with the skill and grace they've learnt, often in difficult and even violent circumstances, over a long period of time. Fixed lists, in short, back people into corners, and we know what comes of that. The second message is that a more flexible approach obviously carries risks of political manipulation, And that means that there has to be a constant vigilance about these kinds of maybe more flexible versions of lists. Without a fixed list, there isn't a single focal point that can be monitored to prevent abuse. Instead, civil society groups and communities would have to constantly monitor several fronts, all the commissions I've mentioned, as well as county governments, political parties, and even organisations like the World Bank and other donors. I don't underestimate how hard this is, and a strengthened civil society movement of marginalised and minority communities would be very useful here. The third message is that moving away from a global and permanent list also provides more opportunity for focusing on actual needs rather than a generalised sense of ethnic exclusion. The CRA approach is a good example here. Their geographical approach focuses on some of the outcomes that are ostensibly driving the minority and marginalised agenda. That is, people want a better and more equal standard of living, which is a very fair thing to ask for. This could be achieved not necessarily through arguments around ethnicity, but through other kinds of avenues like the CRA use of geographic data. And the fourth and final message, and this I'll finish on this point, is that it might be useful to have some more open discussion about these lists, codes, and categories. In doing this work, I frequently worry about the time and energy potentially wasted by community groups seeking codes that have no official relation to anything useful. I worry about the expectation that a code guarantees citizenship when citizenship is already guaranteed in the Constitution. I worry about how politicians can use these misunderstandings and false expectations to take advantage of people. I wonder why KNBS and the Registration Bureau are not under more scrutiny about their powers to determine lists. And I wonder what Kenyans think about whether or not ethnically disaggregated development data would be a good idea or whether it would be too sensitive. Such conversations might, I think, democratize the production of knowledge about ethnic identities and groups, and that, I think, would be a very good path forward. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Yeah, quite lots of literature and data for us to think about this whole question about identity. So now we want to move to the next section of discussions. I have seen a couple of comments. Please keep them coming. Also, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Yeah, so like I said in the beginning, we will do this a bit quickly. We have 3 discussants. So there is Coril, who will start us off. Then there is Dale, and then we'll finish with Rahma. So just to check, Coril, are you online? I see there is Abraham.
That's correct. That's Abraham. That's me.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah. So just Coril is a legal advisor at the Executive Office of the President, and is also the convener of the Open Government Partnership in Kenya, and an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. So he has previously worked as a minority rights advocate, as a founding director of the Center for Minority Rights and Development in Kenya. He has also been a litigation director at Katiba Institute through USAID. Coril also represented the Endrois community in the landmark case on indigenous rights at the African Commission on People's Rights, and the Nubian community in the important right to citizenship case at the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of a Child. Coril has published widely in academia and academic outlets on the rule of the law and minority rights. He holds a Master's of Laws in International Law and Economics from the University of Minnesota Law School, and also a Master's of Laws in Comparative Human Rights Systems from the University of Pretoria. So welcome, Abraham, Korir, and we give you 10 minutes for your discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for introducing me. Thank you, Sam, for such an elaborate exposition of a very interesting and delicate subject. To be honest with you, I really don't have as much in terms of response.
Abraham, just a moment. Abraham, if you don't mind, and if your internet can allow, please feel free to put on your video. Sam had some challenges, that's why she didn't have her video on.
To be honest with you, I'm actually running from my phone, and so I'm streaming this from my phone, and so
no problem then. Please go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think just allow me or indulge me to do this.
Sure,
so I will begin by commending Sam for such an elaborate exposition of a very fascinating subject, which obviously, as you've heard from my introduction, is a subject that I've been involved with quite a bit. When we established the Center for Minority Rights Development early in 2000, our theory of change at that point in time revolved around the idea that if minorities were recognized in law and policy, then that would begin to address the problem of marginality. We took this theory seriously enough and deployed it in aid of our advocacy around the constitutional review process. And Sam has highlighted quite a bit in this, this aspect. But fundamentally, we were able to secure within the constitutional text a number of provisions that speak to the problematic of minorities and marginalized communities. We were able, for instance, to secure the broad definition of marginalized communities and groups in Article 260 of the Constitution, even though we did not secure a definition of minorities. Now, the lack of definition of minorities is not necessarily problematic, because even in international law, there is really no universally accepted definition of this concept. The emphasis in international law is the notion of self-identification on the part of groups that feel or perceive themselves to be dominated over, either politically, socially, or economically. And therefore, there is an emphasis in international law, for that kind of definition. And so we were able to secure that gain. We were also able to secure specific gains in the Bill of Rights, particularly Article 56 of the Constitution, which speaks to the right of these communities to receive affirmative action programs, in the area of education, in the area of health, in the area of infrastructure and water, among others. There are provisions such as Article 100 of the Constitution that speaks to the representation of marginalized communities and minorities. And like Sam specifically articulated, Article 204 of the Constitution, which discusses the equalization fund that is targeted at empowering historically marginalized regions so that they're able to function economically at the same level as the rest of the country. And so that was our theory. But what is the empirical situation of minorities 12 years after the adoption and implementation of the new constitution. Again, when you look at it from a structural point of view, which Sam has articulated, there are several institutions that have a secondary mandate to deal with the challenges of minorities, including the challenge of recognition. Sam has spoken very, I mean, the paper speaks very, very elaborately about the role of the National Gender Equality Commission, CRA, and also, you know, civil society groups. But more fundamentally, I think the arena for implementing or advancing the rights of marginalized communities has really been within the arenas of the courts. Courts continue to play a very important role, and I mean, borrowing from the work of Siri Gloppen, the Norwegian political scientist, who talks about or who discusses in her writing and in her work about the counter-majoritarian role that judiciaries can play. There is a sense in which one can argue that this is one side where marginalized communities could have gotten, could have realized greater gains arising from their constitutional recognition as a legal category. But like some alludes, I think courts have really failed to, to provide the kind of juridical clarity. And this is quite concerning, given that in 2012, the Supreme Court itself, while dealing with the issue of gender equality in our constitution, the implementation of the 2/3 gender rule, sort of suggested that to the extent that a constitutional prescription did not provide a mechanism for its implementation, then that prescription is automatically taken as if it is to be progressively realized. So by dint of that, interpretation, it would suggest that the rights of marginalized communities, including those ones in Article 56 and Article 100 and others, are really futuristic, to be implemented progressively in an indeterminate fashion. Now, this contrasts quite sharply with the decision of the same court in 2015 when dealing with an advisory opinion on the land question, the role of the Land Commission on the one hand versus the role of the Ministry of Lands. And in that case, the court observed that constitutional making requires compromise, and in the context of accommodating those compromises, constitutional texts can fertilize vagueness in drafting, creating what the court called legal penumbras. And in the context of addressing these legal penumbras, the court then suggested that it would have to invoke the spirit of the Constitution as a searchlight for illuminating and eliminating these legal penumbras. So you can see a contradiction sort of even in terms of the reasoning of the court in the 2012 case versus the 2015 case. And when you apply this reasoning then to the two cases that Samantha references, you can see clearly that that courts could do more, but they haven't done it. And it raises questions around whether the cases that have been brought before it was strategic enough, or they were just very particular to a very specific issue, and therefore did not invite the court, to elaborate broader standards and reasons that cut across various minorities. I want to really conclude by again commending, I think, just like Sam has done, one of the institutions of government that has done well in this regard, the Commission on Revenue Allocation. However, even while I commend the Commission, in its second iteration of what is called the marginalization policy, which it is required to formulate every 5 years. One sees a conflation on the part of the Commission on Revenue Allocation, because they conflate the notion of minorities and marginalized communities in the definition of beneficiaries, of the Equalization Fund under Article 204. And this arises, in my view, from the fact that the state has actually completely failed to implement seriously any of the provisions, of the Constitution touching on the economic rights of marginalized communities, including Article 56. Which provides for the establishment of an affirmative action program. And so what CRA has done basically is to transform the Equalization Fund, which was intended for a different purpose, into into this affirmative action fund that is designed to be established under Article 56. So that conflation then defeats the purpose of the Equalization Fund and does not necessarily respond, to the lived realities and challenges of marginalized communities. And I think this is therefore the reason behind the continuing quest and search for on the part of marginalized communities and minorities, for recognition. They feel that their recognition, their juridical recognition, is still not sufficient to the extent that they have not been implemented. I want to submit that part of the challenge that marginalized communities continue to face is a challenge within government of who is really the true owner of this agenda, who owns the agenda of marginalized communities within government. Is it CRA? Is it NGEC? Is it courts? So to the extent that there is no owner of this agenda, the challenge always is that because institutions have very specific interests to advance, and to the extent that this specific interest does not devolve seriously to any specific institution, then it's bound to fall through the cracks, so to speak. And I think part of what government needs to do is really to begin to think around, what is it that it can do to institutionalize, redress, around, the issues faced by marginalized communities and minorities. I really want to end there, given the time that we have and given a bit of technology challenges that we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abraham, for your intervention, which is really appreciated. Yeah, so the way we structured this was that we'll listen to all the discussions, and then we can give Samantha a chance to respond, and then we'll also come back also to some questions, either from raised hands or what is also being put in the chat. So let me then introduce the second discussant, who is Dale Abraham. And Abraham is a writer based in Marsabit County, Northern Kenya. His works have appeared both in local and international magazines, including Chimurenga Chronic, Kane Prize, and Kwani, as well as the Commonwealth Writers Ada platform. Dale also writes regularly for The Elephant on contentious issues that mostly affect minorities and the marginalized communities. So welcome, Dale Abraham, and you have 7 minutes for your intervention. Karibu sana.
Thank you very much, Herbert and Samantha, for your presentation, and Abraham too. I am more of a storyteller than an academic and analyst. But I mean, Samantha, this is an interesting paper. I mean, you've done your presentation is equally really good. I think for a lot of minorities and marginalized groups, and if however people self-define, this is an important document. I mean, people don't engage on a larger scope, because partly sometimes they don't have the voice, the agency, they don't even know which institution to look for. And I think the way you put this together is you've shown how there's no one particularly responsible, and even getting ethnic coding or being on a list doesn't solve any of the problems. So communities that have been oppressed or excluded from government projects, development in regions like Northern Kenya, assume that inclusion in a certain list, or having an ethnic code, or even being listed on the census is a kind of fix-it-all solution for access to education or land or development projects of so many kinds. And this really creates a problem, because we've seen communities spending significant time and resources in accessing this meaningless thing called a code. We've seen, for example, the Makonde walking from Kwale to Nairobi, a distance of about 500 kilometers. We've seen the Wayu, the water community in Marsabit, advocating for inclusion in census for 30 plus years. That's like, or communities like Shona holding a citizenship prayer day. So all these spectacles, I think, kind of contribute to what you call constructed vagueness. And they're part of, I think, the mystification and mythologies that governments create, and the fictions that they create, in which people look forward to benefits from the state. But it's basically, I think, meaningless, and the targets also keep shifting. So who do we blame, for example, for what's happening to the Sakuya community in Marsabit? It's exclusion. They're not participating effectively in the devolved government of Marsabit County, and they're not also visible at the national level. So who do we blame? Even at the national level, we've seen with things like biometric registration, the pilot project that was done by the National Police Service, communities being forced to identify as either this or that, and that's not the identity. So the Sakuye, for example, are being forced to identify either as Borana or Somali. Yeah, and also I think one other thing I wanted to mention is while we've seen a lot of people trying to fight for inclusion in these imaginary lists, at least one community, the Orma in Tana River, are also struggling to have the name Gala, which is a very pejorative word and term that is not reflective of the identity, removed from the census. So yeah, this is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abraham. Yeah, really appreciated for your intervention. And now finally to Rahma. Yeah, so Rahma Hassan is a PhD fellow at this University of Nairobi and also at the University of Copenhagen. She's part of a project called The Rights and Resilience. And she's currently writing her PhD thesis, whose research is on decentralized land reforms and pastoralist access to land, but focusing on community land rights. So welcome, Rahma, for your intervention, and you also have 7 minutes. Then we'll come back to Samantha for some responses. Samantha, also have a look at the chat, quite some conversation going on there. Welcome, Rahma.
Thank you, Herbert. Let me break the order and put on my video. I hope the internet doesn't become unstable, but thank you everyone for attending the IDS seminar. And Samantha, of course, Dr. Sam, who is well known to us, some of us IDS students, who's a mentor and a teacher with her different support to graduate students in Nairobi. So we appreciate, and I also want to appreciate your continuous work on citizenship and issues of ethnicity, and on this piece on minorities and marginalized communities. I think you've been very consistent, and you have listened, tried to understand and bring forth in different forums. So this is very much appreciated. Listening to both Korir and Dale is also interesting, just to see the different things that emerge from this conversation. The last one being Dale mentioning Gala as one of the lists. Personally, I come in here, with a mixed bag, because I I have had trouble with this identification myself at a personal level, and I will not go into that. I will focus more on my work among pastoralists who are identified as marginalized groups in the North. But to imagine that the name Gala has been relating to the Orma, and the Gare of Northern Kenya have been forced to identify as Kenyan Somali, and the name is actually written as Gure and sometimes Kenyan Somali or Somali So State. So there's so much that we can discuss on that conversation. So it's good that Dale brought it out. But some of the ideas I thought about when I was reading your piece, some revolve around the ideas of around the counting of the indigenous groups and the context in which you present your paper, which is very recent in 2022, happening at the National Gender and Equality Commission offices, is very interesting. So it means groups are coming together to establish a single definition of who minorities and marginalized people are. And there is some effort to ensure we define indigenous people so that World Bank funded projects could be able to protect these groups. And I also see the multiple spaces of recognition reflected in your thoughts and paper and in previous works, which I've had the privilege of reading, both local, national, and international spaces. Like the UN has the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. At the national level, some of the examples you've mentioned about identity, nationhood, deep grievances remain unsettled to date around registration of persons, even identification cards and birth certification, an area you've researched on. And at the local level, where now I am working, communities are still questioning membership and belonging to different setups. And this also includes who becomes a member to a community, for instance, and in Matters Land. And some of those references, I think, heavily will be informed by my research, because that's where I feel more comfortable rather than the ideas around identity. And so I want to suggest that there are ideas about legitimation here that you would further consider, and I think you're already considering them. So this legitimation idea about shared beliefs on who seeks these claims and the processes of claim making to be included in the register or to seek a code, and ideas of political profiling and making people visible. For instance, the purpose of the inventory, as you say, there's this stubborn, persistent idea that it's necessary to list the groups, but then there's also an equally persistent failure to accomplish the agreement on what this list should do. And there are also questions that pop up in my mind around inclusion and how representative they are. But maybe I had another question for when I was reading this. So if we abandon the idea of listing, yet we have an already decided list in our minds, at least I can count up to 15, almost going to 20 on those that are not contested. So what happens to those that are not already registered? But then there's also a disagreement on who could possibly be put on the list of either marginalized or minority. But I also think there's a bigger problem, which you allude to in this piece and previous work, about even just being identified as a community first, before we go to the subgroup of whether you're minority or marginalized. So in this context, what are the rules of inclusion and exclusion? And back to legitimation, under what circumstances can a group successfully seek a code and get it? Thinking about groups that go to the National Gender Commission, those that have gone to court, like Korir has mentioned, under what circumstances, and how many others are thinking of this, or how many others are excluded? As you argue that you would suggest tolerance for uncertainty, and so that we leave this list, we abandon the list at the definitive list, and maybe think more about the uncertainty that would come from such processes when they are not very definitive. But then what does this say about these ethnic categories? And as Coril has also mentioned, if the suggestion is to progressively realize these ideas of identity and recognizing groups, so at what point will we say that we have reached the realization, even in affirmative action? If it is progressively being realized, who will make the call and say, okay, for this community, you're out of the list, and let's consider another community? And the same applies for minorities. In the work we do, there are many minorities within minorities, even among pastoralist groups. So I have an interesting comment to make about the law, which you state very clearly, because I'm looking at the community land law, and I haven't studied law, but I am looking at the local people's experiences of the law. So this is the reality. So the law versus the reality. So if the law ostensibly has promises to honor the differences and these historical injustices in the past, as some is indicating, the implementation of the law, as in the Constitution, is happening in contraction. So that's one of the things that I think is common between the piece of work that I'm working on in the implementation of community land law and issues of identity that you present. But then in terms of the institutional framework that you've listed, I was curious whether some you have come across the work of the Public Service Commission, because then there emerging questions about representation in employment, the targeted material redress. So we are supposed to, Article 10 and 232, the values and principles of governance, and 232, the values and principles of public service. So these interest groups are supposed to be included progressively again into jobs and public service, at least so that we have this national face. And I think that is the report you're referring to. But I know every year the president in parliament, I don't have the details, but has this values report. And in this report, we government agencies are supposed to report every year how far they have achieved this yardstick of including more people from different communities, and especially increasingly recruiting and promoting and training people from marginalized groups. So I would suggest that's another interesting place to look for this. But then I have also thinking this idea that recruitment should be done through competition and merit, that is the yardstick, but then there is diversity, inclusion of minority and marginalized groups in affirmative action to be practiced. Yet it's self-identification. So when I'm filling a form, I have to keep writing how I self-identify, and then I'll be told, no, this is probably a subtype of this other community. So these ideas around individuals self-identifying versus groups feelings and belonging. So lastly, I would want to state that if the issues of self-identification, there's community identification, and regardless of how we look at it, they continue to be fluid in nature, and the questions of belonging are really deep. So having worked in some of these communities for my research now confirms that these ideas are being experienced and translated differently. And ideas matter, like Thandika Mkandawire says, and I think sometimes he says they matter most, how people experience and think about them. And these ideas around identity, especially, and ethnicity have been contradictory. You say that they've been conflicted because of how they are understood by different groups. And so in many cases, or maybe some cases, they are erroneous, but they still matter. So thank you for bringing forth such an interesting topic. And I think you have many other ideas to explore. And since it's work that you're committed to, I'm excited to see how much more you can do with this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rahma, for your intervention. Really appreciated. Yeah, so we will move straight away to Samantha. Please feel free to give a response to all these interventions. Yeah, so we can start with this, and then we can also give a chance to people to raise their hands and give some interventions, and then we will also look at the chat for the comments that are already there. So Samantha, please welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. And apologies again about the video. If it's okay, I might just quickly jump to Karen's question because she has to go. I don't know if she's still online. She is, I can see her. Okay. So, and then I'll come back to the comments from the discussants, which were just so fruitful. So I like the way you phrased the question, Karen, about what I suspect as opposed to what I know about what's going on behind the scenes with the codes. So many of you in the room will be researchers, others are community members or activists or legal advocates. And I'm certain that all of you have had the experience of suspicion that you can't prove, right? You can't get any data, or no one will go on the record saying that this is what's happening with the codes. So it is definitely only suspicion. And that is actually something that in another part of the book, I am also writing about the difficulty in accessing kind of transparent information from government agencies. My suspicions are that there's a very electorally motivated politics behind some of the codes, for example, the Makonde Code, and that there is a lot of executive interference in low-level bureaucracy at the level of ID cards, which would explain why Makonde got gazetted and then immediately all got ID cards. Similar things have happened with Shona people. I am still working on this part of the research, and I have a few leads to try and work out a little bit more about this relationship between this kind of imaginary, kind of hyper-political idea of a code that gets given by politicians to people and then appears to have these opaque but effective relationships to getting access to ID cards. So, you know, watch this space. And Karen, I know you also work in that space and probably have your own suspicions about that. But that would be my answer to that question, is I think there's a lot of politics going on there, but it is incredibly difficult to prove. So yeah, it is only a suspicion. And yeah, something I hope we can talk about a bit more. I don't know if there's anyone from NRF, from the Nubian Rights Forum here, who might have something to add on that later. But to come back to the discussion, unfortunately, Korea has had to go. But thank you so much, Dale and Rama, for your really insightful comments. Rama, you made so many comments. I'm not going to have time to respond to them all, but they were all excellent, and I hope we can keep talking about it. But I suppose maybe what I want to highlight to kind of bring it together, I don't want to talk too long because I want people to have time to ask questions and have further discussion, is that I think, you know, all three of the discussants have highlighted this complete disconnect between the certainty of law and what law promises, what the Constitution, legislation and litigation promise, and the realities of kind of people's lived experiences of trying to get these codes, and the very, very kind of messy and political nature of that. And I think this is a real challenge for minority and marginalized communities and for civil society activists in this space, is to work out how to work in between those two spaces. Because, you know, as Korea said, and as he and many of his other colleagues, some of whom are here now, you know, organizations like Katiba, they use strategic litigation to try to advance rights. And that is a big tradition in Kenya, to advance the rule of law as a core way of kind of activating democratic rights. But as a political sociologist, I am also very interested in the ways in which law is not experienced, as Rama said, by people in the way it's imagined, or in the way that activists and so on hope that it will be experienced. And my experience is that bureaucracy fills a lot of that space. People's experience when they go and register for, go and do their biometric registration, or people's experience, you know, when they are being enumerated by a census enumerator, that is actually often the space where this all plays out. And that's where this kind of mess is happening. And so I think, you know, from a from a perspective of how to advance all the problems that people have mentioned in the chat and that I've listened to people talk about for many years, I guess perhaps my take-home point is that we need to be pursuing both of those things at the same time, that law alone is not going to solve this problem, and that bureaucracy needs more attention than it has been given so far. Those are also not the only two areas of attention, but I think that's kind of one sort of take-home message from this and from the very useful discussion that we've had. There's a lot more that I could say, but I'm conscious of the time. I really would very much like to hear other people's thoughts as well. This is just a draft. There's plenty of room to improve and to develop the argument and the ideas further. So I would, if it's okay with Rama and Dale, if we can move on and ask some other questions, and I'll have the good fortune of speaking with both of them independently later.
Yeah, I think that is fine, Samantha. Yeah, so thank you very much for that as well. So let's open up this for some questions or comments from the participants. And please raise your hand if you want to give some intervention, and then we'll give you a chance to do that. You can unmute yourself also and speak up. You're welcome. Great. So 2 hands. We can begin with Osman and then Rajab. Osman, please go.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for the meeting that we're having. It's really enlightening. And it's one of the burning issues that minorities have been having for a long time. Me personally, I've been really perturbed with what has been going on, recently, especially during this electioneering period, that we've seen how marginalized communities, minority communities that have been marginalized. I just want to touch on Samantha's issue about the coding. I'm from the Nubian community. Actually, I'm the cultural ambassador for the Nubians. I've been really passionately following the issues of the minority tribes for quite some time. The issue about coding is that as a community, we've been what we've been told by the activists and the people who've been pursuing about the issue of the code, is that what is being portrayed is that as long as the community gets the code, it's one of the main identity things that will be recognized in the country. Because once you get the code, because I think there's 2 codes. One code is for the identification card, and then there's another code. What I learned from is that there's a code which you're given, the community is given to be recognized or be numbered as a certain number in the communities in Kenya. So I think, as what Samantha is saying is true, the code doesn't carry much weight in terms of development and other issues in the community. But many communities think that once you have that code, is definitely we're going to be recognized and everything is going to run smoothly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Osman. Rajab. Hi, Rajab. Your connection seems not to be so great.
Rajab, we can't really get you, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Rajab, maybe you could write in the chat.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I think Rajab's connection is not so great, so request him to put in the chat. Let me.
Technology is so difficult sometimes. It allows us to connect across the world, but then we get these difficulties. Okay, I've just muted him, which I feel terribly rude about, but I've also sent him a message and asked him to write in the chat, so we'll try to come back to him if that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Yeah, sorry about that. Ben Nyabira, please come in with the intervention.
Thank you, Herbert. Sorry, I shall also put on my video, like very few of us have done today. Thank you, Sam, for the presentation and all the persons that have given their views. I have very short, probably 2 or 3 questions. The first one is just a very small comment about the Makonde issue, and I think it's the same thing with the Nubian. Based on my understanding, first, I don't think giving communities a code is important. I remember, I think the Indians were alleged to be the 45th community. And I remember at that time, my former chairman, Professor Ashpal Gai, complaining that the code hasn't assisted him being of the Indian origin. And so I'm not sure if the court assists, but in the case of Makonde and the Nubian, I thought the issue was that in Kenya, citizenship is by descent. And on the basis that there were no, the Makonde people could not claim any descent, there needed to be a certain mechanism to tag them to some descent. So I thought maybe they then claim that by giving them a code as Kenyans, then it gives them something to stick to as descent. Because unless you have one of your parents as a Kenyan, then it's difficult to get citizenship in Kenya. Well, I think that is the reason, but I don't think they had to go all through that to be recognized. In any case, if the recognition was done, it could as well be done even without having them to walk to Nairobi. Anyway, I think that is my first comment. My second comment is about, again, relating to the issue of coding. My third one will be a question. Just today in Nakuru County, the court has just stopped the process of vetting the county executive committee that was appointed there by the governor on the basis that it has 7 members out of 10 from one ethnic community, and yet Nakuru is very multilingual. So they've stopped the process until the case is heard. And I was thinking, okay, so if we had the courts, could they have assisted? I'm asking myself, what if out of the 7 who happen to be broadly from the Kikuyu community, what if they claim that 2 of them are from the Kikuyu, 2 are from Embu, 2 are from Tharaka, and 1 is from Meru? Would that still be balanced? I know at the national level, the other way we try to obtain balance is through regional balance, but then in the context of a county, they can all be coming from different parts of the county. So the regional aspect may also not assist the argument in this aspect. So on that basis, then I'm not sure if coding could have assisted in such a case. It probably wouldn't. I think my question now is largely now because some seems to be in favor of some small coding as long as it's flexible. The rest of the speakers seem to be agreeing with a possibility of coding, I think, those who have commented on the presentation. There's one country that has some form of coding in one of the states, and that is, there's a small state in Italy called South Tyrol. And what that coding includes is so much. For example, now it just involves 3 languages, but even with that, it's a big trouble for them. For example, each of those communities has veto on the legislation that is passed. So if, for example, our coding is to work, then it has to mean something. For example, it means that each of those communities must have potentially veto power on legislation. There are many other things. For example, public officers must speak at least 2 languages in that part. So my question is, if we're in favor of potentially such coding, how is it going to address the claims that ethnic communities have? Just to clarify that a little bit, and I'm taking too long, some in the research that you referred to, the Katiba Institute research, we were looking at the claims. At that time, I was with Katiba Institute, and none of the claims was specifically for communities wanting a distinct recognition as communities. Most, if not all, of the claims were mostly related to discrimination. So it means that if there was no discrimination, let's say in Tanzania, for example, there's potentially no discrimination, most of these communities could not have the claims that they have. So the question is, can codification assist in addressing those claims? There are about 10 claims that we listed. There's no time for me to list them here, but for me, if coding is just for historical purposes and maybe for just cultural celebration, for me, that is fine. But if it's to address the claims, I don't see how practically it's possible to address the claims. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ben. And yeah, I see that, sorry, Rajab, about your technical issues, but you have put your issue in the chat, and you say, my concern is that as much as there's no list of ethnic groups, they are listed in the public service portal. Hence, when applying for a job, you are to identify your ethnicity. And most of the marginalized and minorities lose out because they are not included. So the question is to Sam, have you looked at this? So Sam, welcome. We have 18 minutes to go. So please feel free to respond to these questions. And then also to give you liberty to see some of the questions or the comments in the chat that you may also wish to respond to. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Herbert, and everybody for all of these excellent questions. I'll start with Osman. Thank you so much. So I think, you know, if I'm understanding correctly, what you're saying is that there are activists in the community who are saying, I think you said that once we're recognized, everything is going to run smoothly. And I think this is part of what I want to address with this research, is that that expectation is not a reasonable one. There's not a lot of evidence that being given a code is going to make everything go smoothly. There are a couple of cases here and there, like the Makonde and their ID cards, but I think the kinds of issues that are affecting the Nubian community, those same issues around vetting, that they can be addressed without a code. And I think there's also plenty of evidence, as Ben's comment about, you know, Professor Yashpal Ghai, that code didn't make any difference, right? It is, I think Dale's just put a comment saying it's a smokescreen. I think it's okay to pursue a code as long as everyone is clear that it's purely symbolic, right? That it might make people feel like they belong and make them feel recognized, but there's no evidence that it is going to make everything run smoothly. So I think that's a kind of myth that I want this research to dispel, so that people can start thinking about other ways to address the particular needs that people are trying to get addressed through a code. And so, you know, the elimination of discrimination in citizenship would be, I think, probably a better way to go about this than seeking a code. And I know the Nubian Rights Forum is also advocating for that. But there could be in terms of civil society, much more alliance between the very many different groups who get discriminated against and vetted for ID cards. And there could be a claim around non-discrimination rather than a claim for getting a code. The other problem with linking a code to citizenship is that it's unconstitutional. You know, the citizenship chapter of the Constitution is very clear, as Ben has indicated, that the issue around what entitles you to be a Kenyan citizen is features of your own individual biography, whether you were born in Kenya and whether you have parents who are Kenyan. If I was born in Kenya and had parents who were Kenyan, I would also be entitled to citizenship, regardless of the fact that that I don't, you know, by birth belong to any particular ethnic group. Although I do have strong connections to the Nubian community and want to acknowledge that. So, so I think, you know, Osman, I know yours was a comment, not a question, but that is what I would say to that. Rajab's question about the Public Service Commission, and Rama also raised that. I'm yet to look at that. As I mentioned, the work is a kind of work in progress, and it is my intention to have a look at that as well. But I think, you know, my suspicion is it will just confirm everything that I've already talked about, which is that it will have its own list, come up through its own internal processes, which probably will not be the same as any of the other lists. There will be particular ways. In fact, I've heard some stories about how particular groups can get themselves on the list, but that process is not transparent, right? Or even really fair. It seems to hinge on knowing someone in the right place, which is not a fair way to secure access to these kinds of things. So I can and will have a look at that, and you know, can talk about that next time I give a presentation. But as I said, I do think that it will reinforce the kind of argument that I have been making already. Ben has raised so many, you know, excellent points, and I'm really grateful, Ben, for all of your comments and your questions. You've put a little clarification there around citizenship law. The difference, I think, between the Makonde and the Nubian community is that Nubians have been in Kenya for many, many generations. So my understanding is Makondes have been as well, but Nubians certainly have been since 1897. And so it should be the case that they are automatically given citizenship because they do comply with what the Constitution says about access to citizenship. And I agree with you that individuals should be given access to citizenship based on whether or not they meet the criteria in the Constitution, not based on their ethnic identity. They shouldn't be vetted on the basis of their ethnic identity. If they're able to provide documents showing that their parents were Kenyan citizens, then that should be sufficient. And there really shouldn't be any need for a code. And I don't think it was really the right thing for that code to have been given to the Makondes as a link to citizenship. If they wanted it to be symbolic, that's fine, but it does reinforce this idea that citizenship is an entitlement on the basis of your ethnic identity, which it's not, which I think is also what you're saying. I would love to know more about that Nakuru court order. If you can email me something about that, that would be really fantastic. I would like to have a look at that. But the point that you raise about that is a good one, right? It's not just Kikuyu that if you said, okay, Tua, Embu, Tua, Tharaka, one is Meru, you can do the same with Kalenjin, with Luya, with Mijikenda, with Swahili, with Somali. Those classifications can be used in all kinds of creative ways, some of which, are good for the advancement of minority rights and some of which really are not. And so I think, part of my argument around what you've referred to some small coding as long as it's flexible is that I think, and in all honesty, I'm still working on formulating how I think this would look. But But I think the kind of coding that might work would have to be not only flexible in terms of being revisable and being able to add and remove groups, but it would also have to be targeted to a particular purpose. And the problem, I think, with the census and this generic idea of a code and so on is that it's not particularly targeted to a particular purpose. So if the purpose is balance on the county executive, then I think, you know, possibly each county needs to have a discussion about what that would mean for them. And I suppose what I imagine is something much more kind of localized and low level and much more flexible. What you're talking about a situation like in South Tyrol where a particular group could veto legislation, in my mind, that's not flexible coding at all. That's incredibly rigid coding. And I don't think I would be in favor of that, but I know you've sent me a paper about that, which I'm yet to read. So hold fire on my conclusion about that. Yeah, so I mean, it's a big question. The way you've put it, if we are in favor of some kind of flexible, low-level targeted coding, how would that address the claims of ethnic communities? I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that. And I think a lot of it has to be worked out in the kind of fine detail. Part of what I liked about the Commission for Revenue Allocation, even though I think Career and I have different views on this, is that it looks specifically at, you know, if you want to talk about particular claims, well, let's look at the claim to water. Where is the water? Who has it? Who doesn't have it? And how exactly can that be addressed? That doesn't necessarily have to be addressed through ethnic coding of any kind. You know, it can be addressed purely through looking at quantitative data and identifying where the gaps are and then filling those gaps accordingly. There are other circumstances where ethnic coding would be necessary, and looking at something like support for Indigenous cultural practices or Indigenous languages might be an example where you would need ethnic coding of some description in order to be able to advance that. So that's my kind of very tentative answer to that question, is that first, there's not one single answer. Second, it has to be flexible, meaning groups can be added and removed. And third, it has to be targeted at a specific need or a specific kind of claim. And then conversations need to be had around what is the role of ethnicity in this. You know, is it necessary to be having ethnic coding here? Could this be done in another way? And so on. And I think the more kind of local and negotiated those things are, the more likely they are to address the actual problem. You know, if the actual problem is water, or if it's vetting, or if it's lack of access to jobs, then they need to be considered, I think, you know, almost sort of one by one, rather than in a universal way. But as I said, I'm still working through this in my mind. So, you know, I hope we can have more conversations about that, and I'd be interested to hear what other people think about that as well.
All right. Thank you so much, Samantha, for your responses. Yeah, I maybe also to abuse my privilege. This is just not really a question, but I was struck by what Corinne said, that sometimes movement towards, you know, seeing the implementation of these issues that we are talking about also matters in terms of who is the owner. So he posed the question, who is the owner of the agenda? And, you know, that really struck me. And so maybe to turn that question, if we say, who should be the owner of this agenda? Samantha, I don't know what you have to say this, but we have a few minutes to the end. So if we have somebody with a question or a comment, please, this is the chance. Otherwise, we give it to Samantha to make some concluding remarks. And then I will also invite my colleague, John Joka, who is online, to say something on behalf of ideas. But otherwise, for me, I want to say that I am very thankful to all of you that have come today. Thank you to the discussants. Thank you, Samantha. I believe that especially for our students who are also on the seminar, those who are not exactly experts in this area, they have learned quite a lot. Personally, I feel like, you know, when I saw the Makondes being given ID cards, I really celebrated. But what I'm learning today is that there is much more than just being given the cards, you know, in terms of, you know, like asking and demanding for their rights. I thought it started and ended with being given, you know, the ID cards. But what I'm hearing today, unless if I'm mistaken, is that actually there is much more to this. So back to you, Samantha, for your concluding thoughts.
Thank you so much, Herbert. I'm so grateful for all of these comments. I might just say quickly, I agree with you actually, Karu's comment earlier that there's been a lack of a kind of central organ of responsibility for minorities and marginalized communities has been a part of the problem. In terms of who I think should be responsible for that, my research over the years has shown me that there's what matters is the people staffing the organization, right? So I've talked today, for example, about 3 different commissions. Only one of them is functioning particularly strongly. And I don't think there's any special formula there. I think they have some really skilled and dedicated staff. You know, I'm not going to defend everything that they do, but I think that's actually the key. So wherever it is, whether it's, you know, is in the office of the Attorney General, whether it is in a commission, whether it goes to the Human Rights Commission, it is a bit beside the point. As long as there is a location with staff who are committed and want to sort of really push to take the agenda forward, I think that is where the difference gets made. But the other thing I will say is that civil society, I've seen over my years working on minority and marginalized communities' rights and issues, so many incredibly committed and talented community groups, but it's been much rare to see them work with each other. And I think if minorities and marginalized community groups could work more closely together, then I think they could do much more to put pressure on government to establish such an office, you know, and coordinate and push back against some of these funny lists that are emerging, educate each other about what experiences they've had with different offices and so on, and, you know, build on their collective expertise. And so I think, you know, it's not just government that's responsible, it's also, you know, citizens and civil society who I think could mobilize. You know, and they did that during the constitutional review process. That's how they got those, as Korea mentioned, that's how they got those provisions in the Constitution. So that kind of energy and commitment needs to come back, I think, if government is to be pushed to address some of these issues. And I guess the contribution I'm trying to make with this research is that I think it's not only law that needs to be the focus of that conversation, it's also these bureaucratic functions, and they need to be interrogated and called to account more than they have been.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much once again for this opportunity to present with us, Samantha. And we look forward to the publication of your work, and also to future possibilities of inviting you to, you know, another seminar. So we really thank you. John Joka, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, Wamalwa, thank you very much. I can hear you. Yeah, you have pushed me and promoted me to be the director. Yeah, but that is good because the institution needs some representation of some sort. So So thank you very much. Mine is really to give a vote of thanks to, first of all, to Samantha. We actually at INDS look at you as a colleague because you interact a lot. And this is another one of your very good papers. And I was telling my students yesterday, I teach a course on knowledge, education, and development. I was telling them that they must be here. And on Tuesday, we will discuss what we can learn from this in terms of knowledge, because the classifications you are talking about knowledge and then getting updated on what ethnic groupings are all about, and how that is looked at from political, technical, even economics, like what the whatever this revenue allocation commission, and even what is going on in commissions like NCIC. And I like your conclusion that really these things are not useful for development, but that also it is a responsibility of everyone to think about addressing inequalities and injustices. And we need not to get into a blame game. That one is very important, asking who created this marginalization and who should be responsible. We need to look at the situation. If all of us have been looking at what is happening in northern Kenya, particularly where there is a lot of starvation and all that, and the people and livestock are dying in huge numbers, we need to be touched, not just as scientists, but as citizens, as Africans, as people who have interest in other human beings. That is usually the call of INDS and the University of Nairobi, because we stand for service for humanity, and we stand for research at INDS, which makes a difference in people's lives. So I thank you very much for prompting the discussion which has gone on here. And people like Abraham Correo, very, very good human rights people, they have also made their voice. So has people like our student, Rahman. I also thank them, the discussants, and everybody else who has contributed here. And I would like to encourage other people who are within and outside IDS who have listened to this, to really bring these papers and get into these seminars, so that then we continue propagating the cause of knowledge. And also it's a way of advocacy for some of these groups and also other constituencies that we may identify. Even the students are encouraged to come up with the seminar topics, not just wait for their master's and PhD moments. So on that note, thank you everybody. And thanks Dr. Malwa for chairing this. You did it very well, very efficiently. Your first seminar after the PhD. So we might make it a seminar coordinator. So thank you everyone. I think Malwa, it means I close the meeting, right?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Great. So on that note, by the powers of a quasi director, I declare the seminar over, and good evening. Enjoy the rest of the week. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm very appreciative. Thank you. Asanteni.
Karibu.
Bye, Sam.
Bueno,